As funding models for many Christian missions have changed over the last 30 and 40 years,
Right.
And there are, in some instances, fewer boots on the ground and now more resources being delivered through government agencies. Do you think the scope of the impact of missions is going to change as well?
Yes. Okay. I think the impact of missions has decreased over time for multiple reasons. One, there's a much smaller percent of the provision of education and printing and other things like that. Governments do that now, other groups do that now. So the impact of missions is a lot smaller, except in very, very poor places. So like a place like South Sudan or Afghanistan or something like that. They're making a crucial difference because they're often more willing to go to the really hard places and stay long term than government aid organizations are. They're also finding out that a lot of government aid doesn't seem to be that effective. There doesn't seem, like the research on it suggests that it mostly doesn't benefit people broadly long term. But these voluntary organizations that are working at much more at a local level and staying longer term and avoiding some of the sort of corruption of giving money to governments seem to be effective. So we should at least evaluate current missions and current non-religious voluntary associations and compare them to the really big government-funded models to see if currently what extent these effects are happening. But over time, I do think the effect of missions has declined. I also think another reason it's declined is that Protestant missions over time have sort of like given up education to the government, whereas Catholics have not. They've continued to stay in education where Protestants have abandoned it. So I think you have a switch on that. I also think the Catholic Church has increased their distance from the state, and because of their organizational strength and some of Catholic religious teaching, I think they're more critical of abuses now than Protestant missionaries are. And so I think some of these effects actually over time will have reversed. But as missionaries have abandoned their same extent of involvement in education and other things like that, I think their influence on these types of things has diminished.
Thank you. Tim.
Thank you very much for that really quite wonderful presentation. My questions are somewhat mechanical based on your presentation, which is why, one, you kept the, I think it's Dutch colonialists in the presentation, but equally why you had such a difficult time getting your article published in the US Journal. And is that because it treads on so many people's toes about the work they've done in the past and its contribution?
The reason I have Dutch in there is the Dutch had early Protestant missions, but they funded them directly. And they didn't have religious liberty until the late 1930s. So they paid the salaries of the missionaries. They moved them around so they wouldn't get too much influence. They originally banned Catholics entirely, and then later on they kept all the denominations totally separate from each other so you didn't have any religious competition. They made them give back their letters to Europe in company ships in open letters so that they could read them and censor them. They often picked German and other foreign missionaries so they wouldn't go back to the Netherlands and tell people what was going on. And when there was abuses, like for example in Ambon in what's now Indonesia, there was a massive slaughtering of indigenous people, and the missionaries started to create a protest, and they basically said, shut up or leave, and so then they shut it up. So you had state control of Protestant missions, which then didn't have the same positive effect as when you had greater religious liberty. That's why they're controlled.
And your article being published?
Oh, yeah, the article being published. I would say people have very strong opinions about missionaries. And often the less they've studied them, the stronger the opinions. So they would think, that can't possibly be true. It also like undermines a lot of things that people have been writing for a long time. So again, and the effects are huge. So that scared me a little bit too. But it just there was a lot of resistance to this. So originally it got rejected at the American Sociological Review, and they wouldn't tell me what was wrong with it. Just one of the viewers said it made him angry, which I didn't think was a critique. Then at the American Political Science Review, I took 192 pages of supporting material. I can tell you all the details that they asked me to do, but it took more than a year. There were 5 rounds of resubmitting. Then it got accepted. Then a week later, the acceptance was revoked because the editor had his graduate students read it and they got angry and accused me of making up the data. So then I had to make my data sources public, and I had to make my data public, and I had to give all my coding rules and all my statistical models to the editor, who then reran all my models and checked them and see how robust they were to adding and subtracting measures and using different measures of democracy, and then he found that it was consistent, but then he asked me to add a table based on his runs, which I did, and then I made another table which sort of undermined the thing that he was trying to do in that table, because I wanted my argument to be strong. And then eventually it got published. That's the short version.
Thank you.
Rave Champion, independent scholar. Just by way of background, I should mention 2 of my ancestors were actually Anglican missionaries in India. The Champion, who was in Goa, the Loophole, who was a German Anglican, was in Benares. Now, moving on to my actual substantive question, have you made any connection between your findings and the work of Deirdre McCloskey on the importance of the bourgeois, what she calls the bourgeois virtues in economic development?
I have not. I'm not an economic historian, and I don't focus on Europe. However, there was certainly an alliance, let's say, between early 19th century evangelicals and political economists, sort of free market economists certainly in the first half of the 19th century, where people associated religious liberty and economic liberty. So it was a concept, sort of like, just like state control or monopolies in the economy is bad, that's also bad in religion. And there's sort of, they were allies in lots of things, including the abolition of slavery. So some of the political economists were not mission-focused, and some of them were quite secular and didn't like religion. But they allied with these nonconformist and evangelical Protestants in terms of a lot of these reforms, including abolition of slavery. Like Raffles, who founded Singapore, had a very close relationship with the missionaries, although his actual religious beliefs were sort of ambiguous. He certainly wrote a lot with William Wilberforce. He was very close with the missionary Milne and others, and supported them a lot. He really liked them. So they had this sort of elective affinity, even if they had some different ideas about religion. Now, later on that changes. So you start to get the social gospel movement in the late 19th century. A certain group of Protestant missionaries and Catholic missionaries get a much more sort of Marxist focus in terms of issues, but that's not true in the first part of the 19th century.
Peter Crossing, I suppose independent scholar. I rather like that. The Boxer Rebellion. Now, we've talked about the beneficial effect of missionaries and Christianity in development. You've had massive disruption there, and Christianity was associated with it. It was on one of your slides. You didn't discuss it. Would you like to discuss it?
Sure. The Boxer Uprising is a complex historical event, but basically a lot of it was focused against European colonialism, but also against Christianity. And a lot of churches were burned, a lot of indigenous Chinese Christians were killed, a number of missionaries were killed. You have missionaries in the late 19th century are heavily involved in promoting reform within China. And so you have people like Timothy Richard and others who were, and Young J. Allen and others who were heavily influential on the reformers within the court, the Chinese court. And they're actually invited, so you had a new emperor. They were invited to Beijing to meet with the new emperor and sort of make a new policy for reforming the educational and system and infrastructure in the late 19th century. Now you had the Empress Dowager Cixi, who then poisoned her the emperor, and had him like drugged, and he was like lived on this island in isolation. And then she actually ran things, and then she killed off a bunch of other people. She was at the time very anti-Western. She supported this. It was sort of like a Buddhist sect that. And helped support it, and you get this great, huge violence against the West and against missionaries and against Christians. It was very violent. In reaction, European powers come in and smash it, and then she decides to become on the side of reform. And for a while, missionaries are quite popular. So in the early 20th century, missionaries were extremely popular in China and were heavily involved in terms of reformers. So like Sun Yat-sen, who became the first nationalist president, was a missionary-trained doctor. He was a Christian. Much of his cabinet were Protestants. Now they got purged by, I don't know if this is maybe too much detail, but they got purged by Yuan Shikai, the warlord. And then it's actually after World War I when in the Versailles Treaty they give the German part of China to Japan, and people realize that self-determination is only a slogan for white people. You get this sort of very violent reaction, and then you become much more anti-missionary. And then that's where you get all these people who had been actually quite positive in many ways towards Christianity who become very hostile. And you get then the Marxist support for the rise of the Communist Party. But actually, a lot of the leaders of the Communist Party came out of the YMCA. The Young Men's Christian Association. And some of them were actually purposely trying to copy the methods of the YMCA. So they're like, the YMCA is so good at getting Chinese to go work among the poor, and they create this moral zeal, and we can't get people to do things, so how do we do that? So they make the equivalent of like Bible studies. So eventually when you get Mao and you get the little red book, and they're studying this and memorizing things, okay, that's based on Bible study. Okay, it's directly copied. Some of the techniques that they were using from the YMCA. And this is in their journals. This is not like, they're writing about this in their journals quite explicitly. So, I mean, I don't know.
Graham Hoskin, can call me sort of independent scholar.
Well, I'm sort of independent myself.
Yeah, what you're talking about seems to be most relevant to the British experience.
Right.
I don't think you said anything much at all about the French in Africa or the Portuguese. The Belgians' experience in the Congo is generally regarded as a chamber of horrors, or even the Americans in the Philippines. You did mention the Dutch in Indonesia, I suppose you're talking about. Does your thesis apply very much to those?
Yes.
And also about the Catholic side, it's generally regarded with Pope Leo XIII, the Catholics took a more progressive direction, and especially in the 1960s with Vatican II, and that continues right up until the present Pope. Is there a break or a change in Catholic approach to mission?
There's not the same positive effect of missions in Italian, French, Belgian, Spanish, and Portuguese colonies because there was a close relationship between church and state. So the state put forward bishops to the Pope to be approved. They often paid the salaries of missionaries, and they mostly kept Protestants out. So you didn't have the same religious competition, which changed the behavior of the Catholic Church. And so you don't have the same positive effect. Now, the Belgians were forced to allow missionaries. So they were not a major player, and during the Berlin Conference in the late 19th century, they needed the support of the Americans and the English and the Swedish in order to get what became Congo. And originally it was like a private free state of King Leopold. But they allowed missionaries in there to, as part of their charm campaign, to get the Congo. Now, then they had these rubber companies that he set up monopoly rubber companies that went in and basically they didn't pay people for rubber. They didn't punish you for not providing rubber. So each village had a quota. If you didn't fill it, they would go in and they would burn down your village and your crops, and they would shoot people. And then they had these proxy African armies who would kill people. Then to prove that they'd killed people rather than, that they did their job, some of them started chopping off the hands or penises of people and smoking them and bringing them back to be paid based on the number of people that they'd killed. Protestant missionaries who were in the field photographed that, and they mobilized the major campaign against it in Belgian Congo, which is why we know so much about it. There were comparable abuses happening just north of the border in French Congo and Mbangashiri, which is now Central African Republic. There was only one article that appeared in one Marxist newspaper, and no one did anything about it. And those abuses continued until World War II, just across the border. Whereas in the Belgian Congo, although it was really abusive, they were exposed, and the worst abuses were put to an end. Now, the Protestants were punished as a result of that. So their schools were basically de-recognized. So your degree was worthless if you came from a Protestant school, and they had difficult getting land and everything like that. So as a result, at independence, you had like 2 people who had college degrees in the whole Belgian Congo. I mean, it was awful. But yeah, and then the Catholic Church has changed it over time. Quite radically. It starts earlier on in the 1920s in particular, and you're getting change over time. It's not all Vatican II, but Vatican II is an easy way to say. And some of the concordats remained after that. Concordats being the agreements between the state and the church. But over time, as they've gotten removed, the church has become much more critical. And now I would say they do a better job of exposing abuses than most Protestants do. So if you look at sort of African church leaders who have exposed abuses by indigenous African leaders, Catholics are very prominent in that, as well as some Anglicans. And the smaller Protestant groups are more isolated, and they're more likely to go along and keep their mouth shut. So I think the situation has changed quite radically as the relationship between church and state has changed.
So with your theories of Catholics and Protestants, does it also cover the Orthodox Church?
Yeah.
And what's your experience in the study of the Orthodox Church and how the missionaries have changed the economic landscape and political landscape?
Orthodox missions in terms of the modern era is quite small. They sent missionaries into Siberia for indigenous communities, and they sent some missionaries to China, particularly northern part of China, Harbin area, and they sent missionaries to Japan and to Alaska. But the number of missionaries is very, very small. And Orthodoxy has not had, so at this point, both Protestant and Catholic areas are disproportionately democratic and disproportionately economically developed. The Orthodox areas are not disproportionately democratic. They have, whereas the Catholic Church always has resources outside any given state. And, well, I think the changes start earlier in terms of the Gregorian reforms in the 1100s and other things like that, which create this distinction between law and the ruler. And some of the reforms that happen earlier with the Catholic Church in Europe, which become crucial in terms of the rise of rule of law in Europe, which doesn't happen in the Orthodox world because each patriarch is within each sort of nation. And so there's never that independence to resist the state in the way that the Catholic Church had and shaped Western Europe and why Western Europe is different from Eastern Europe. And that's continued to this day where there tends to be a preferential option for having a close relationship with the state in Orthodox societies, which then has undermined democracy. And then when you look at sort of the fall of the Iron Curtain in terms of Eastern European countries, the Protestant and Catholic areas have democratized and had an easier transition to a capitalist economy than the Orthodox areas. And then even if you look within the same country, it's the Protestants and Catholics who protested and the Orthodox who did not. So if you look at Ukraine, if you look at Romania, etc., it's the Catholics and Protestants who protested. And then if you look at the crucial places, Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czech Republic, there's this, Czech Republic less so, but certainly in Poland and Eastern Germany, etc., there's this crucial role of religious groups in terms of mobilizing those protests. So there seems to be an important distinction between Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity in these outcomes.
Oh, thank you. Barry Maley, Centre for Independent Studies. Thank you for what's been a splendid presentation. I think it was excellent. Indeed, you've convinced me that we're desperately in need of missionary action in this country. And materially and culturally and politically, on all of those counts, we do need mission reaction of some kind. I wonder if you'd agree, and if you did, what would you do?
I generally agree. I think the church is declining in Australia, many parts of it. And I think, at least in general, I think religious diversity and strength of religious groups is important for civil society and important in creating alternative sources of power and organization that are able to limit overreaching by the state.
We have an altar call at the end.
Okay.
But in the Aboriginal community, I mean, I don't know a lot about it, but the churches used to run missions.
Yes.
And I've got friends who teach, and they said the children were better educated when the missionaries were in charge. You know, the parents can read better than the kids, or the grandparents
Right.
can read better than the children.
Right.
So I wonder if we've lost something with society in some ways.
There were abuses that happened in terms of the missions here too, but the real comparison has to be between what happened on the mission schools, mission areas, versus the government schools and the government areas. And there I think the mission groups look better. Now, one of my early caveats is missions, when they're financed by white settlers or by governments, tend not to critique the policies of the people who are paying their money. So when they're getting funding and given people by the government, they're less likely to critique the people who are providing them with resources and people. The people, air quotes, is not that they're people. The air quotes is like they don't belong to the mission, but sometimes they were like given to them like they belong to the mission, which I just think is awful. But I think, I don't know this detailed, I haven't studied it carefully, but my sense is the condition of people who were sent to the mission places did much better than the people who were sent to government places, or where mission activity was not strong. And I also think, I've at least heard, but I don't have strong evidence, I haven't done this myself, that the places that were more independent from state control, the conditions for Aborigines are better than the places that were closer to the state.
Ian Tonking, independent student. I think earlier in your presentation you seemed to make a carve out for areas affected by, or areas where Islam was predominant. Did you make any observations about those areas and their economic development and the other factors as compared with, say, areas where Buddhism was strong, or, on the other hand, areas where missionary activity was influential? I mean, I assume you carved out Islam because it was difficult for missionaries to have very much impact there at all.
Well, Muslim countries are in my data. Muslim societies were more restrictive of missionaries, and colonizers were more restrictive in letting missionaries work in Muslim areas, both. Now, that was also true for some Theravada Buddhist areas, so like central Sri Lanka, for example. Missionaries were kept out. And that was detrimental to the development of those societies. And in countries where you have a split, where missionaries are allowed to work with some groups or in some areas and not in others, it creates these divisions that create resentment and led to violence. So Sri Lanka, India, Nigeria, places like that where you have a line, you can't work with this group, or Lebanon, where missionaries, it was an Ottoman colonization, Turkish colonization, but missionaries were only allowed to work with Christians and Jews, who then, particularly Christians, were at the bottom, and they've moved up, and then you get this resentment with Muslims and violence, eventually. But you can see the effect of restricting missions on all kinds of things. For example, printing. When do you get printing? You don't get printing in the Arab Peninsula until the 1890s. Now, Mecca and Medina were pretty big cities by historic standards for Muslim societies, and millions of people came every year, so it could seem a logical place. It's certainly more logical than printing in Tahiti or Botswana or other places like that where there was printing way before there was printing in the Arab Peninsula. That's because missionaries were kept out. It wasn't because people didn't know how to print. The early Muslim printing happens in, well, some in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt, but also in Persia and in India and in Malaysia, and you can show the link that happens in terms of the triggering of those printing. And so then you get the dominance of Muslim printing in India that's then spreading texts all around the Arab world, Muslim world, not because historically India was the center of Islamic scholarship or writing, but because you had religious liberty there, and their printing got spurred more earlier. And then if you look at, say, for example, in the 1960s or 1970s, at literacy, infant mortality, life expectancy, various things on the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Peninsula, they were dismal. What's changed that is oil. So you have disproportionate amount of oil in Muslim-dominated societies, and that money has allowed them to reverse the lack of literacy and the lack of health care and other things like that, which I at least argue resulted because they restricted missionaries. And so in the 1970s, you have a very wealthy Saudi Arabia with abysmal infant mortality and very low literacy rates, which now has changed. But if they didn't have oil, it wouldn't have.
Are there any further questions? So, make that the last question.
I'm glad you raised the Darrell Allen. I'm just an ordinary person. I hope.
So am I.
But you raised the question of Islam, and I think Islam today is a tremendous threat to the Western society. And I'm just wondering if you could make some comment in that sort of area. Is that asking too much? I'm just thinking Islam is becoming the elephant in the room.
Mm-hmm.
It had tremendous power to wipe out most of the Christian countries, take control of those countries. The same techniques are being used today in the West.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering if you could add some comment to how we might be able to resist this.
Right. Well, I would say that the Muslim community is quite diverse, and there are communities that are within Islam that are very hostile to the West and Christianity, but there are other ones that are not. And one of the best ways to undermine Islamist, anti-Western things is when Islamists win, and then it creates all this resentment. So if you look at like Iran, there was all this anti-Western attitude in the 1970s because of support of the US and others for the Shah. However, since you've had Ayatollahs in power, the young people, at least urban young people, are very pro-Western and very anti-Muslim, and you have large-scale conversions to Christianity and atheism and other things. Same thing in Egypt. After the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, they blew it. And they've lost a lot of young people who are becoming atheists, or some are converting to Christianity. ISIS is having the same effect. So the extremist versions of Islam are self-undermining. So you need to think of it like Puritans. Okay? That's a Christian group that were like the Taliban, or they were pretty radical. They used violence for religious ends, and long term, they had things that I think are quite beneficial, but they were pretty extremist in their day and were viewed as extremists in their day. And then you got a reaction against them, and the children of the Puritans are a lot of your democratic theorists, like Locke and other people like that, who are reacting against sort of the harder edge of Puritanism, but drawing on all these Christian and Puritan ideas about the limitations of government and the independence of groups from government and sort of a covenant, which becomes a constitution, and all these types of things like that. They're drawing on those things, but in a more moderate version of it, because they're reacting against their parents who were a little bit too violent and strict. And so it has a self-undermining thing. Now, I'm not going to say that thing will happen with Islam, but it certainly happened with Protestants and Christians more generally. There are also some reactionary elements within the Catholic Church, which over time have been moderated. So I don't want to say like any religion is frozen, and I also don't want to say because there's an extremist fringe, they will always be that or that's everybody. I grew up in the Middle East, and I have lots of very close Muslim friends who are just really nice, good people. And there's also some really extremist, crazy people. Hopefully the experience of that makes people go, if this is Islam, I don't want it, or I want a different version of it. Now, I also don't think they have the ability to so Islam over time wiped out, for the most part, Christianity in the Middle East and North Africa and places that they conquered. But they were the ones who were in power. And so they could do forced conversion, and they could do incentivized conversion. So if you were a non-Muslim, you had to pay a much higher tax, you had to wear distinctive clothing, there were legal restrictions on you, there's all kinds of things like that, which incentivized conversion in the long term, which they can't do in a place like Europe. They have more kids maybe, but a lot of them become westernized and secular, and then hopefully have an influence back on the Muslim world.
If they can throw bombs, then
they can. It's just complicated.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. I call upon Professor Paul Oslerton now to give a vote of thanks.
I'd just like to begin by congratulating CIS in and particularly the Religion Free Society program for making things like this possible. It's often difficult, I think, in Australia to have a well-informed discussion of religious matters. Bob's talked a little bit about earlier today and at other events about some of the difficulties with academic sociology, political science, etc. But in Australia, in our universities, I think it's partly because of the division between religious institutions and our public universities, and a well-informed discussion is difficult, and there's often a great prejudice towards discussion of religious issues. I've done a little bit of stuff on the Australian Research Council, and there's a very, very dismal story there about the sorts of religious grants and the number of religious grants that are made by the ARC. So in our public culture, there's a great need for well-informed, sensible discussion of religious issues. So the CIS is to be really congratulated for contributing to the richness of this discussion in Australia. They've hosted events by Larry Annacone, who some of you might have heard a few years ago, speaking about religious competition. Deirdre McCloskey, who was referred to tonight, has been speaking on behalf of speaking at CIS events. So it's just really to be something to be admired, Peter, that CIS is a place where this sort of discussion that's important can happen.
Thanks, Paul.
And worthy of everyone's support to continue the sort of events that the Religion and Free Society program is running. But my job here is to move a vote of thanks to Robert for the words he's had tonight. I think Robert's research is exemplary. In an issue which is important, religion matters a great deal. If Robert's results are right, then it matters hugely for economic development and democracy in parts of the world where the Western missionary movement had an influence. So religion matters, and Robert has approached the topic by going out and collecting an absolutely massive data set. He wanted to know, really what the answers were. So rather than cheap sloganeering, point scoring, all that sort of thing, he spent $1 million of the Templeton Foundation's money, years of his own time in painstaking assembly of a data set which is unmatched, and then has carefully worked through that data, answering these big questions. And I think the experience with some of the journals has demonstrated that his research stands up. And so I think it's an example for us in how we should be pursuing these sort of discussions in Australia. Deploying evidence where it's appropriate. Not every question is amenable to the sort of empirical approach that Robert has exemplified tonight. But he's a real example of how to, his research, and which is continuing, exemplifies that. So I think it's been a real eye-opener lesson for us in Australia, an example for us in Australia, of how to pursue these sorts of questions. Myself and some colleagues at Alpha Crucis have been conducting a campaign this afternoon. I strategically invited a few people who are knowledgeable about Aboriginal issues, including a really bright young woman who's doing a PhD on Aboriginal Pentecostalism, trying to lure Robert into working on political and economic outcomes of Aboriginal missions in Australia. Sometimes you've got tons on your plate, but we really hope we see some work on Australia in the future. Mm-hmm. But let me please join me in thanking Robert for a really wonderful presentation tonight.